Hi, welcome everybody. This is the September 11th, 2018 Portland Planning and Sustainability Commission. On the agenda today, we will have items of interest from commissioners, followed by the director's report. The consent agenda has consideration of the minutes from August 28th meeting. That will be followed by a briefing for Better Housing by Design project and a work session for the residential infill project. Are there items of interest? Michelle? No.
No? Okay. So last Wednesday, the City Council passed a resolution committing to continue investing resources in the Oregon Solutions-led LINTS Stabilization and Job Creation project. This is a project that started in July of 2016 and focused on resources out in the LINTS area generally. This is an area that has properties that are within the Johnson Creek floodplain. And it was a situation where a lot of the residents were having financial stress from the fact that flood insurance was increasing at a rapid rate. We had one example of somebody that was actually putting their premiums on their credit card. That's how bad it had gotten. And so the goal of this was to bring together bureaus of the city, state representatives of various state agencies, residents and local business, to discuss ways to address both that housing stabilization component, because you want to keep people in their homes rather than deal with it after they're out of it, but also look at the opportunities. There's some industrial land down there, and sort of consistent with the comprehensive plan, the idea that there's an opportunity to increase the job density on those properties and provide hopefully good wage jobs for local residents. So you're also getting at that affordability by just raising people's incomes. So it's trying to get at the housing component, the job creation component, and at the same time, we know East Portland has been park deficient. There's a perception that there's an opportunity to increase the green space out there by acquiring some property for increased flood water storage. That could be accessible green space when it's not filled with water. So I had the pleasure of serving as a co-convener on that with Representative Reardon, and it was phenomenal to see different parts of all these agencies getting together and sort of getting out of their silos and keeping the eye on this sort of greater goal and not being so tied to the project you necessarily went into it with, and trying to figure out what strategies would be the best bang for the buck going forward. There's been national attention to stuff that's come out of the Housing Bureau related to this. There was a great job done in terms of helping people right-size their policies. There was a program that helped people get elevation certificates, so you had a better idea of how your property actually sat relative to the floodplain, and that brought a lot of people's premiums down. And then we did a lot of work relative to better understanding the industrial land there, so that going forward, when there are opportunities, we'll be able to jump on them. And there was a lot of mapping done, so we have a better sense of where the water actually goes. And I think going forward, there'll be a need to do remapping, because we see areas where it looks like people are mapped by FEMA as in the floodplain, and they actually aren't, and vice versa. So the city is committed to keep working on that, and I think that eventually you'll see some things coming to the PSC in terms of things we can do in the code that would help all of this move forward. That's it.
Great work. Thank you for the update.
Sure. Thanks.
Chris?
Yeah, I had the opportunity yesterday to attend an event out on 122nd Avenue where Pbot and TriMet were celebrating the new frequent service line on 122nd Avenue, and I'm encouraged to see that the noise we made about better transit service in East Portland is at least slowly beginning to take effect with the new line on 162nd this year, and now frequent service on 122nd. So hopefully the momentum can continue.
Other items? Andreas?
I actually had two items I wanted to follow up with staff on around public testimony. The first was a while ago. I had asked if we could, this was in response to some of the testimony we heard originally from residential infill and later with Better Housing by Design, where I was concerned that some of the public testimony was drifting from the proposal and was getting into territory that I felt was disrespectful and making sometimes broad generalizations. And so I was wondering if we as a body could think through coming together and having some sort of standard that we can explain to people and something we can remind them of. And I wanted to check in because I know staff mentioned they had talked about that.
Yes, Andreas, I have talked with equity staff, equity program staff, and a variety of bureaus about how to draft this, and just need to complete drafting it, and I can try to bring it back next meeting.
That'd be great.
Thanks.
I'm just following up with this because this is my second to last meeting, so I will soon not be here reminding people.
So perhaps we can make that a gift for Andreas.
Yes. And then the other item that I brought up a couple meetings ago, I think, was relating to the testimony for the manufactured dwelling zones. I always mess up the name. I'm really sorry. The manufactured parks project. If there's a way we can develop some sort of early feedback mechanism of just saying, we have this much time, we have this many people, we're likely going to run over, just to give the public an idea of how the testimony will or won't impact. That was a request that came from Living Kali, who felt that had the people who showed up to testify in favor of the project known that it would delay being able to discuss the project better, that they might have made a different choice in how to use their impact on the project. So I was wondering if that was something that the officers had a chance to talk about.
I think if I'm understanding your comment there, Andreas, or the feedback that we've been getting, they're looking for impact prior to us having open deliberations or comments. Is that correct?
I think their thought was that they recognized that the direction their testimony was taking, while was incredibly impactful and each story was important, that they were echoing similar points and might have decided to defer their testimony time in exchange for us having time to deliberate the proposal that day.
Great comment. I think certainly as chair, I can take it upon myself to remind people, perhaps more than just the beginning of the meeting, that if they have testimony that is similar in nature, perhaps they just raise their hand in the audience and they don't need to actually come up. And I could perhaps, when we see we have a lot of people, do that multiple times. And that's one idea. I'm certainly open to other suggestions.
I think I hesitated with it because I think it might be a pretty unique situation, but when we had such a volume of people testifying and we knew like we lose this room at this time or we're going to lose quorum at this time, allocating 3 minutes per testimony and the number of testimonies we have signed up, that's going to put us over time. We won't have time to deliberate. I don't know if it's appropriate or if the commission agrees that that kind of information to the audience would be appropriate, but I think that was the idea of just having some sort of way we can signal like, here's an update meeting, this is where we're slated or scheduled to go to, just for your information.
Great feedback. So perhaps for those who aren't in the officers meeting, we do prior to it, when we expect a lot of testimony, kind of map out time and whether we think we can fit it in or not and how things are going. We usually have, if we expect a lot of testimony, I would say maybe a backup plan or something in our pocket for, okay, what's going to happen if we find, we want to give people the opportunity to testify if they want to speak. And I guess I'm always inclined to, if that means we're deliberating on a different day. And I understand the feedback is that also creates kind of havoc. I guess it's just keeping that in mind, and as we're trying to weigh the options of letting everybody who wants to speak versus putting off deliberations. To me, I guess the best feedback I'm thinking is as we're nearing kind of those deadline type choices, to kind of say, remind the audience again, we may have time to deliberate. So if you're going to just repeat what we've already heard, then we could get on to deliberations. It seems like a good solution. So that's good feedback. Yeah, Chris?
So I have a comment on that, and then I have another item as well for items of interest. At least my personal bias is to give the community the maximum opportunity to speak. I think the situation we were in with manufactured dwelling parks was that the advocates were as much invested in us making a decision quickly as they were in us making the right decision from their point of view. I think that's a pretty unique occurrence. So I think, maybe being transparent, as Kat said, about sort of the impact on the schedule is fine. I would be very careful of doing anything that looked like we were discouraging people from testifying. I just want to be careful about that. So the other item I have is I did ask Pbot for a Vision Zero update, and you all got that in your meeting materials, so I won't dwell on it. I'm just going to highlight that at least as of the end of August, we have 23 fatalities on our streets this year, and while that is still a horrific number, it is lower than the number of fatalities for the prior 3 years. So I take a little bit of cautious encouragement out of that. And we also started out well last year, and then it got just as bad as recent years. But I'll cross my fingers, and I would ask you to look at the list of accomplishments and planned actions that Pbot put together, because it's an impressive list, and I'm glad that we're putting focus on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Any other items? Julie, you want to weigh in on the visitors? Thank you.
How do I use this thing? I never talk. So we have a visiting group of planning commissioners from Sacramento coming in early October. I think they're going to be here the 8th and the 9th, it's looking like. So they would be interested in, they'll probably attend your meeting on the 9th, at least in part, and then they'd be interested in meeting probably one-off individually with some of you if you're interested, probably on the 8th. I'm working with First Stop Portland that we do quite often when we have tours and that sort of thing. So if you're interested, and I'll just put this in the meeting notes and you can let me know, hopefully within the next couple days, so we can start scheduling those.
So planning commissions get field trips?
Yep.
It's like, wait a minute.
It might be on their own dime. We'll
I
have
am
to
not
ask that
sure
in
how
one
this
on one
is being
meetings.
funded exactly.
Any other items of interest? If not, doesn't look like it. Director's report, Joe?
Yeah, thank you. The first item, I wanted to give you an update on appeals for Central City Plan 2035. We received 2 appeals, one regarding heights in Chinatown, Japantown, the other regarding a property affected by a view corridor in the Central East Side, in the southern part of the Central East Side. So the next steps on those, they've been filed. The staff and the city attorney are preparing the record and expect to have it to LUBA by the end of October. There's a process, then there's a process for people to object to the record and any appeals and our responses, and then LUBA, based on those responses and the record, writes a decision, and that's likely to be sometime in 2019. So the thing that we did not anticipate, should have known, but that while under appeal, amendments to the Central City Plan are not something we can do. So there's this, the code's in effect, but the ability to do additional changes is affected during this appeal period. Second, is related to the comprehensive plan, and that is at the Court of Appeals. An appeal was filed on August 29th. We don't yet have the information on the appeal, but we believe it's related to the policy on middle housing. It's coming from Multnomah Village, a coalition of folks. Once the appellants file their full argument, it will likely take a year or more to resolve. Meaning that in late 2019 or early 2020, similar with the City Council appeal, the comp plan's in effect now. It doesn't affect that, but there's still this cloud hanging as that gets resolved. Finally, the Global Climate Action Summit is happening this week in San Francisco. That's why Susan's not here today. The mayor and his staff and staff from BPS are all attending, and they're presenting on various topics such as energy efficiency and renewables and waste and transportation, the full spectrum. It's 1,000 people from around the world participate in these C40 events. The focus is primarily on business and local governments and non-governmental organizations. And then in addition to the main conference, there's more than 300 sort of affiliate events. So this is a big, and it seems annual, gathering, international gathering around leading policymakers on sustainability.
Sounds exciting. Okay, next item on the agenda. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody trying to get my attention. Next item on the agenda is consideration of the minutes from August 28th. Do I have a motion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Nope, that passes. So first item, first, I shouldn't say that. First large item on the agenda is the Better Housing by Design briefing.
Hello.
Welcome.
I'm going to try to reawaken the presentation here.
And the project.
Yeah, and
You
the
need me
project.
to log in.
It's been a little while since we've
And,
spoken last on this.
Yeah, it's been I'm Bill Cunningham, project manager for the Better Housing by Design project with the Bureau of Planning. Oops. Oh, wait till I can get
Sorry.
close.
Perfect. Thanks, Bill.
Maybe if I could log in.
Okay. I'm Bill Cunningham, project manager for the Better Housing by Design project with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. As I mentioned, it's been 3 months since we last were before you and had a public hearing, so it's been a little while. So there are 3 main things we want to do with, I think, less than an hour of time we have with you today. And generally, our session right now is to really set the table for the work sessions that will follow, starting on the 25th of September. 3 things we want to do is, 1, provide you a refresher on what the project proposals are. I know RIP's probably taken a lot of your attention, but did want to remind you what the proposals were. Very brief overview of the kind of testimony we received, and then we really wanted to focus on the upcoming work sessions and to have a discussion with you as to what are the topics or the potential changes you would like to focus on during those work sessions. So if you would keep that in mind, and we really wanted to breeze through a lot of the material, so we're suggesting that people hold off on any questions or comments till after we get through the presentation, just so we can get through it. I think you're aware of this, but we've been in the midst of a major rewrite for all the zones that allow residential development. And the multi-dwelling zones occupy a spectrum of housing types that really fall between the mixed-use zones in our centers and corridors and the single-family zones. In fact, the lower scale definitely overlaps with the residential infill type projects, in that many of our lower scale zones have essentially been duplex type zones, but they also extend up to 6-story allowances in some of the zones, so similar to what you have with the mixed-use zones. We have about 8% of the city's land area in multi-dwelling zonings. Not a huge chunk, but it's an important chunk. Typically, the multi-dwelling zoning is located, shown in blue here, close to our corridors and around our centers. So fairly essential to our policies that talked about providing housing opportunities close to services and around our centers. I wanted to remind you that we have 3 primary volumes and appendices, and I highly encourage everyone to take a very close look at volume 1. It's a fairly slim volume full of nice illustrations, so I really encourage you to get very familiar with that at the very least. It's all important, but volume 1's especially so. The major topics we've grouped our proposals in relate to major comprehensive plan policy direction, a number of policy or proposals that relate to expanding the diversity of housing options and affordability, expanding options that work for more Portlanders, including considering things like accessibility. Also, another batch of proposals that relate to outdoor spaces and green elements, which relate to priorities for encouraging healthy, active living. Other proposals that relate to building design and scale, especially how development relates to fostering a pedestrian-oriented street environment and contributing to a positive context. And then another batch related to East Portland and street connections. With that, I'm just going to launch right into it. Housing diversity. I should highlight that about 90% of our land area with multi-dwelling zoning is for low-rise zoning. usually 3 or up to 4 stories. And so there's a lot of overlap with that topic of middle housing. And there's been a lot of community interest in cultivating a diversity of housing options, as you often had historically. You might remember that I'd mentioned that we took a close look at our historic middle housing types that were built in our older neighborhoods before we had our modern zoning code. And a lot of the housing was 2 to 3 story scale. Our lower scale zones are definitely within that scale realm, but our current R2 zone, which applies to more than half of our multi-dwelling zone land area, would only allow the duplex. If you wanted to do these others, you'd have to be in higher density zones. And in fact, for these courtyard apartment types, they're just 2 stories, but you'd have to be in the RH zone, which only applies to 10% of our multi-dwelling zoning. So 90% of the city's multi-dwelling zoning wouldn't allow some of these courtyard housing types. And we wanted to explore how we could broaden that range of housing types. And the core, I'd say a very central part of our proposal is a proposal to regulate by building scale instead of unit density, with more flexibility for what happens within that scale. This is illustrating a pretty common situation of the R2 zone with a 5,000 square foot lot. Currently, you're limited to 2 townhouse units. They could be quite large townhouse units. And we're proposing to keep the same general scale, and actually in this zone, tamp it down a bit to 35 feet, which corresponds to our CM1 mixed-use zoning that's often in residential areas, and also our R2.5 zone. But within that scale, allow, it could be a pair of units, 3 units, 4 units, and what's not illustrated here, and which is different from the RIP proposals, you could go beyond the 4 units as long as it fits within the 1-to-1 floor area ratio that's proposed. Along with the greater options or density is allowed, if you're going to go beyond those 2 units in a 5,000 square foot lot, our proposal is to require that 20% of the units be designed to be visitable using similar standards that you reviewed for RIP. This is one we will have to focus on some during our work sessions, because there are issues in that this would be mandatory in most of the multi-dwelling zones, which conflict somewhat with state law. So we'd have to seek a local exception to state building code requirements for this to move forward the way it is written. Similar approach to the R1 zone, which is along our corridors in terms of regulating by scale, more flexibility for density or numbers of units. The image in the left is showing an historic building in the R1 zone. It's 34 units in a 10,000 square foot site, and that's 3 times the density that's currently allowed in that R1 zone, definitely within the 4-story scale allowed by the zone. So we're looking at revisiting that as well, regulating more by that scale of building, establishing FARs, and as with the R2 zone, requiring that a portion of units would be designed to be visitable. A key thing that this leads to is our R2 zone, R1 zone. The full names of those zones are really based on unit density. R2 is residential 2000. So we're proposing a new zone name scheme that is more in correspondence with the mixed-use zones, where a small number is a lower scale zone, big number is a bigger scale zone. So RM1 is the lowest scale zone, and we're proposing to combine both the existing R2 and R3 zones into that zone. One thing that's been a source of confusion in some of the testimony is about the RH zone. We're proposing to break the current RH zone into 2 new zones that are based on the FARs that currently apply in that zone. Areas that already have the 2-to-1 FAR allowance would shift into the new RM3 zone. Areas that have the 4-to-1 existing FAR allowance shift into the RM4 zone. There was a lot of misunderstanding that we were rezoning RH zones to the greater 4-to-1 scale, but in actuality, we're just providing the same FAR that already exists. One thing I should mention too is that part of the proposal, and I believe this came before you a couple years ago, it relates to the bigger scale RH zoning, the new RM4 zone. Currently, if you're near a light rail station, you're allowed up to 100 feet of building height. And we're proposing to change that. So if you're within an historic district, you would not be able to achieve the 100 feet of building height. It would be a 75-foot height limit. But this is one topic we got a lot of public testimony on. The diagram shows both a base FAR and a bonus FAR, and wanted to just say a little bit about how you would get to that greater scale. One, if you look at this middle column, in terms of we're essentially setting a 50% increase in FAR limit for most of our bonus and transfer allowances. And for projects that voluntarily or through mandatory inclusionary housing are providing affordable units, they would be able to achieve the full 50% increase in FAR. We also have a bonus that's geared towards moderate income family housing, where if half the units are affordable at 100% of median family income, which has been difficult to achieve with new housing in many areas, you would get a 25% bonus, not quite as extensive a bonus as inclusionary housing. And then another set of things that would allow you to get to that 50% scale, and this would probably be especially important for sites that don't trigger inclusionary housing, so smaller projects, are allowances for FAR transfers from sites that are preserving the existing provisions we have for historic resources. We are proposing a new one that would, in exchange for preserving existing affordable housing units, you would be able to transfer unused development capacity to other sites, and also a transfer in exchange for preserving large sites on a site. You would be able to transfer that unused development potential to another site. We also have a third option beyond the base and the standard bonus, which for projects which are providing a deeper level of affordability, where at least half the units are affordable at 60% median family income, you'd be able to achieve 100% of the base FAR and gain additional height and building coverage. And that's really intended to prioritize more deeply affordable projects, which were really essential for the city's housing needs. Another note is some of these provisions, as written in the proposal, would not be possible to use in historic districts. The FAR transfers could transfer out of historic districts, but the proposal is to not allow transfers into historic or conservation districts, out of concern about compatibility in those historic districts. Also, that greater bonus for deeper affordability, that, as it's written, would not be allowed to happen within an historic or conservation district, also out of concerns about the scale. So that's something to be aware of. So that's the spectrum of zones. Wanted to highlight one other thing, is that this map, which it's hard to read right now, is showing where the multi-dwelling zones are. The light blue is the lowest scale RM1 zone, and that mid-blue color is R1 zoning. So you can see that the lowest scale RM1 zone often extends further away from our centers and corridors, often in the midst of areas that are really predominantly single family. And the darker blue is more commonly in centers and along the corridors, and the highest density zones in some of our most intense centers, such as Northwest. Another new direction is a proposal that on our major civic and neighborhood corridors, allowing small-scale commercial uses in the multi-dwelling zones on those corridors. And it's based in part on provisions we have along in the Albina Community Plan District along Martin Luther King Boulevard, which has provided some options that hadn't otherwise been there in the multi-dwelling zones. And it's also been an important topic for East Portland, where they have a lot of multi-lane arterials, not always the best environment to have your living room or bedroom right up to the sidewalk. And there's interest in allowing more live-work situations or small business opportunities. We have another batch of proposals related to outdoor spaces and green elements. Some of these also relate to some of our East Portland discussions. Our RH zoning does not require any residential outdoor space, and we have a fair amount of that zoning near light rail stations in East Portland, where some projects were providing no outdoor space when they're lucky. In some cases, it's the parking lot that's the main play space. And we're proposing a similar approach we use for mixed-use zones, where the higher density RH zone, now to be RM3 and RM4, would require outdoor areas, smaller amounts for small sites up to 20,000 square feet, and larger amounts per unit in the larger sites. Another key proposal too is for large sites more than 20,000 square feet, requiring that an area equivalent to 10% of the site area be set aside as common area, although some of this could be indoor common space. And this relates to community discussions we had with tenants and immigrant groups about the need for people who don't have their own backyards to have more substantial spaces for things like play areas and growing food. Another proposal within that topic area is to provide more flexibility for urban green options like eco-roofs or raised courtyards to meet at least a portion of the landscaping requirements. Currently, landscaping must be at ground level in the ground, and so this would address or provide more flexibility. Related to greening up our urban areas too is a proposed limitation on large surface parking lots, where we're proposing to limit surface parking to no more than 30% of the site area. It relates to climate action plan goals for limiting urban heat island impacts, which parking areas, especially asphalt parking, are a major contributor toward. Because of the greater impacts of the dark asphalt surfaces and causing urban heat islands, we're proposing a stricter limitation on asphalt paving to 15%. So you can get to the full 15%, but you would have to do a situation where it might be a mix of asphalt and a lighter color material, such as concrete or pavers. We're also proposing something to address some of the large parking issues on the other end, which currently, if you're more than 500 feet from a frequent transit service line, you have to provide one space per unit. And 40% of our multi-dwelling zoning is beyond that frequent transit buffer, including this example, and it's showing one space per unit. So just meeting the minimum parking in an inexpensive way has resulted through those requirements for a large chunk of the area devoted to parking. So we're proposing for large sites, reducing the requirement from one space for every unit to one space per 2 units. And for small sites, not requiring parking for projects up to 30 units to facilitate development on compact sites up to 7,500 square feet in size. I should mention too that we're not touching our existing allowances for low or no parking when you're close to transit. So this is primarily affecting areas beyond the frequent transit buffer. We're also proposing a transportation parking demand management approach that would apply to larger buildings with 10 or more units close to frequent transit. And this involves funds that would go to things like transit passes, although there are currently exceptions for affordable housing. Another batch of topics more related to design and context are these. A key one, and this really relates to key urban design goals for pedestrian-oriented street frontages, is to limit individual garages and structured parking to occupying no more than 50% of the building frontage. Currently, we have no limits on row house garages and multifamily garages, and so this would be a change. So it would be encouraging options where you do rear parking. We're also providing options related to the small sites of a no parking option. One thing I should mention that differs from RIP is that in the multi-dwelling zones, we frequently get a mix of townhouse type development without land divisions and row houses, each on separate lots. And in the single family zones, there's a 50% garage limit applies to each individual row house. We're proposing a situation for attached houses where the 50% limit applies to the combined frontage of the units, as it does with multi-dwelling development. So you could have a mix of units with garages and some without. We're also proposing a disallow any parking between the fronts of buildings and the streets. And this differs a bit from residential infill too. For duplexes, for example, RIP would allow front parking pads in front of the units. We had proposed that our proposal would require that parking to be set to the side of the front of buildings, such as an example to the right. We're also proposing requirements for street-oriented entrances or entrances that front into courtyards. Another key proposal, which was a subject of a lot of testimony, are proposals for deeper front setbacks in some of the zones. Our current R1, RH zones allow 0 or 3 foot setbacks, And we're proposing 10-foot setbacks to address privacy issues and also to encourage street frontages that continue the green edge of most residential areas. There's a fair amount of nuance to this, though. While we're proposing 10-foot setbacks in the RM2 and RM3 zones, it could be reduced to match existing buildings. If you're doing ground floor commercial in most situations, you could do 0 setbacks. If you're raising a ground floor, you can get closer to the sidewalk. Or if you're doing courtyard buildings, the building wings could come up to the sidewalk as long as you have a large chunk of courtyard green that contributes to that green edge. We're also simplifying our setback side and rear setback requirements, shifting in most cases to a standard 5-foot setback intended to facilitate development in small sites. However, we're applying a 10-foot setback for a building is more than 55 feet tall. These would typically be subject to design review where you could modify those setbacks. We're also proposing, in common with the mixed-use zones, that for the larger scale zones, building height would be required to step down in scale close to single-family zones, down to a 35-foot or 3-story scale. And this is a map showing how that would apply. The blue shows the multi-dwelling zoning, and the dark blue shows lots that would be subject to the step down. And our analysis showed about 30% of the RM2 sites, which are often on the corridors, would be subject to the step down. A lot of multifamily zoning, though, are broader areas that extend beyond the corridors, and it'd be less of that requirement in many cases. We're also proposing another mixed-use zones approach where for larger buildings, there would be a requirement for facades to be articulated or divided up. I'm not going to get into detail there so we can get to our main topics. Our East Portland standards focus on areas identified as the Eastern Portland pattern area in the comprehensive plan. We're proposing, there is a lot of interest in our community discussions and keeping the middle of the large blocks you have in East Portland less built up and greener. That's often the places where you also have groves of Douglas firs. There's interest in precedents from other places where in many cases there's quite a bit of density in situations and areas where you also preserve the middle of blocks as less built up. So our proposal is to require on deep sites in East Portland that 25% of the depth of each lot be set aside as unbuilt area. And our modeling is showing that you'd still be able to achieve the densities and FARs allowed in the zones, but this would definitely be a departure from current approaches. And what's most commonly built for the lower scale zones is what you see on the left. We are, based on community discussion, there was some concern that if we kept or focused just on deep rear setbacks that make it harder to do centralized courtyards. So the proposal includes an exception where if you're providing larger outdoor spaces equivalent to 10% of site area, you're exempt from that rear setback requirement. So it would accommodate a lot of the central courtyard options you see with some multifamily development. Another East Portland issue has to do with the very narrow, deep sites you have there. These are about 60 feet by 300 feet deep. And issues there are the fact that driveways to accommodate just a minimum amount of vehicle maneuvering end up occupying a large amount of space, no space for street connections, not a lot of usable space. Our proposal for center areas was to establish a minimum street frontage of 90 feet in order for development to occur, getting us beyond the pretty standard outcomes you get in the 60-foot wide sites. And this map is showing the areas where that would apply to the multi-dwelling zones. Another aspect intended to encourage new street connections to be created is an allowance for development allowances to be calculated prior to street dedication. Currently, if you're doing a private driveway, which is often a large portion of site, you lose no development potential. If you're providing a connection and therefore a public good, you lose development potential because that site area is subtracted from your allowances. And we would be changing that. Just a couple notes about Pbot's proposals, and they were focusing on an analysis of the Jade and Rosewood center areas. is they were developing new options to get us beyond our current situation where typically if a standard street cannot happen on a site, you go straight to no connection. And East Portland has had very few new connections created in the multi-dwelling zones. And Pbot's created a new set of options where before you get to no connection, you have a range of narrower connection types that would provide opportunities for connections in more situations. A change of topic. Just want to very briefly summarize some of the testimony received. We received 270 pieces of testimony. I'd encourage you to take a look at the public testimony during the hearing on June 12th. And perhaps not surprisingly, the topics that received the most testimony were about density and parking. And for most of these topics that received a lot of public testimony, there was very divided input. Density, there are a lot of people, especially people who didn't know they lived in multifamily zoning, who are really concerned about any multifamily at all. In many cases, it wasn't a specific concern about the proposal, but just against the change. We did get quite a bit of testimony, though, from people who supported the proposal or wanted greater FARs than we proposed. For parking, very divided as well. Many testifiers were concerned about parking impacts and didn't want us to reduce parking requirements. Others supported the proposal or wanted us to go further and get rid of minimum parking requirements. Very divided too about the massing of buildings. Some felt our proposals were allowing too much scale, buildings are too big. Others are saying, no, we should provide more flexibility for greater height. Quite divided. We also got a fair amount of testimony about zoning map. We aren't proposing specific zone changes to properties. We were just proposing the most comparable zone. But we got a lot of proposals or testimony specific to the RM4 zoning that's proposed in the Northwest areas and Kings Hill, they were calling for a RM3 zone and less FAR. I did want to clarify, however, that our proposal is not proposing an increase in FARs there. The 4-to-1 FARs people are concerned about already apply in those areas. In terms of where we received testimony from, a lot of testimony from inner southeast, a lot from west, and especially regarding, again, those historic districts, and then a scattering from a range of places, 8% from East Portland. So that brings us to our work session schedule and topics. The 25th, September 25th, would be our first major work session. And we took the liberty of creating a draft schedule based on issues that were raised by you all during our briefing and in subsequent emails. And these relate to some of the major topics. So the individual discussion topics will be parsed out, I think, moving forward. But for the first September 25th work session, we're proposing something that helps bring some commonality and understanding the RIP as well as this project. And we would want to present for you the spectrum of the residential zones going from single dwelling to multi-dwelling to provide some context to set the table for discussing the proposals for multi-dwelling zone FAR and scale. If there are issues related to those topics, this would be the time that September 25th session would be the one to focus on that. Also, we'd be discussing bonus and FAR transfer provisions during that session, for which we have 2.5 hours. One thing I highly encourage you to provide to us is, especially for the September 25th session, we need to get a good handle on the specific changes you might be requesting or specific issues you'd want to discuss so we can line up that discussion. And we're asking that you provide us your suggestions for specific issues by this Friday, so the 14th, just so we can set things up in time for that session. On October 9th, we have a lesser amount of time, just an hour and a half, and we're proposing to focus on some of the East Portland standards and any street connection issues in that more limited time session. And then November 13th, we're proposing to focus on visitability. There are a number of outstanding issues that have been raised, as well as a range of building design topics, such as building setbacks, height transitions, and then also parking and TDM requirements, especially since there's a strong relationship between parking requirements and building design. So those would be the three main topics. And then December 11th, we would be returning to you for final reconciliation of the decisions and for a recommendation. And that's the same session which you would be voting on recommendations for RIP. So there'd be a coming together of the two projects. So 3 primary work sessions. Again, these are broad topics. We'd be interested in hearing from you. Are there some topics that are missing, that maybe your specific concerns don't fit within these? So with that, I'd open it up to your input. What is it that we need to work through during these work sessions? Are there concerns about the staff's proposals you have or changes you'd like to make? We're happy, of course, if you feel our proposals make a whole lot of sense and they're good to go, but we want to make sure we discuss the issues that might be there.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate you running through that and for the outline on the work sessions. So is there feedback or comment that we'd like to provide at this time? Andre, go ahead.
So the bonus transfer, and I'll send in this as a question, can that be transferred anywhere in the city?
Yes, the proposal is for the transfer of FAR from historic resources, tree preservation, existing affordable housing. The transfer would be possible to go across the city, except within historic districts and the central city. And that's partially to increase the marketability of those transfer allowances. And especially since it may help smaller projects achieve those intensities when they're not subject to inclusionary housing.
Okay. And the other question, I was not clear, the Pbot proposal, is that a separate, that Pbot is just going to do on their own, or is that actually connected? So you follow that tree, decision tree to a small street, and you get a small street with the development type.
The Pbot Connected Centers proposal and document, there's not a formal role in the PSC in voting for it. You can choose, if you'd like to, convey your recommendations to City Council, but there's not a formal role for PSC. Ultimately, it'll be City Council that approves the Pbot proposals. The things that you do have control over are the zoning code proposals that relate to the connected centers proposals. Some of the minimum street frontage requirements, for example.
Thank you.
Okay. Michelle?
So this is sort of related to that, trying to get clarity between what's Pbot and what we're dealing with. So in the TDM discussion, something I read talked about you pay into the fund and then the transit passes go first to the low-income residents. And my questions on that just are, was there any consideration of finding a way to prioritize people that don't have cars, since we're talking about changing parking? And then I'm also wondering about people that may not meet the MFI but are otherwise cost burdened, like say somebody with student loans. So if you look at their paycheck, yeah, they're okay. But if you look at what they're actually living off of, their challenges.
Right. The TDM requirements, part of it is in the zoning code because the trigger for the requirement is there, but Pbot is responsible for the administrative rules, for the details for how the TDM is applied. We could involve Pbot in the discussions about the administrative rules, but the purview of this body, as I understand it, is more about whether the requirement is going to be in the zoning code and less about the specifics of their administrative rules.
Okay.
Right.
Eli?
Thank you, Bill. As you know, I've already dug back into this packet and sent some questions. And in terms of topics, one of them that maybe you've already slotted this in mentally to one of these sessions is the Main Street question of setbacks with respect to abutting commercial mixed-use zone properties. that may already be in here under building design. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're a range of setback type topics would be in that one
Okay.
For November 13th.
Okay, and I guess I'm not going to take time here for some smaller topics that I thought about, but one of them that's larger, I think, is historic conservation district exclusions. I am concerned that in various places, there's only so much place in the city to build stuff. If we're saying you can't use certain entitlements like a bonus FAR or transferring in FAR in certain parts of the city, I want to know whether there's equity considerations there. For example, there's no conservation or historic districts in the eastern pattern area. Those areas with those overlays would be sort of off the hook in terms of helping provide housing supply. That raises a potential concern for me. And it comes up in downtown areas too with height limits. So I guess I'd like to have a thoughtful discussion about that before we just say, okay, we're going to exclude those districts from more height or affordable housing bonuses or stuff like that.
That's good to know. I think we can include that in the bonus and FAR transfer discussions.
Can I just sort of related to that? So just a question, you said that in the historic district, we're going to 75 feet versus 100 feet. And is the idea that you would actually be able to get 75 feet, and that's trying to reflect what you'd get through design review, or is it still something that could be lower?
That would be the maximum allowance, but the Historic Landmarks Commission has purview over the details of that. They have a current project that's been undergoing discussion in the Northwest District where a 5-story building in the big RH zone has been a focus of contentious discussion. So that is one issue there in the historic districts, that you may not be able to, it might be that you may not be able to fully realize the allowed height. I think it's maybe another topic as to whether the FAR is something you're more entitled to. And I believe some of the DOZA discussions are exploring what entitlements are and what is the purview to be changed by the design or landmarks commissions.
Thank you.
So related to both those comments, I guess one is if we're going to, one frustration going through the whole Central City process that I think we often expressed was making sure all the stuff that you just talked about kind of gets aligned, and that we're not putting into code stuff that historic commissions are never going to allow. So if we have to set up, so I guess where I'm going to go with that, some type of side committee to kind of maybe work through that, if it's not tied to the DOZA discussion or trying to get historic commissioners kind of involved in that discussion, I think that would be very helpful. And then additionally to Eli's comment, specifically, I had in my head as you were discussing the historic proposal, concern that there may be neighborhoods and this will cause them to trigger deciding to go straight for historic status just to keep this from happening. So I guess understanding that potential and what that, just more specifics on that at a later date would be helpful. Any other questions? Andreas and then Katie.
So there's a lot in this proposal that I really appreciate. One of the components was the moderate income family housing. I did have a question about how it would work, though, because I know in residential infill, when we were discussing bonusing units with 3 bedrooms or more, BDS told us that counting bedrooms was too complicated and something that they did not recommend doing. And I think the city has an interest in family-sized units, and particularly in multifamily zones. So I think that it's great that it's in this project, but I just kind of wanted to circle back and close that loop on how we would be, if we're sure this would work, and if that's something the city can do.
I can't speak to the RIP's approach for this. I can speak to the fact that we have an existing 3-bedroom bonus in the multi-dwelling zones. So there could be a difference between whether it makes sense to regulate numbers of bedrooms as base regulations, but in terms of bonuses that don't apply to every proposal, we do have an existing bonus allowance. The primary difference with what we have currently is that you get bonus density regardless of affordability. And a concern raised was that we don't want to be allowing or providing incentives for extra large $1 million townhouse units, and the emphasis should be on moderate income affordability.
Absolutely. I really appreciate the approach. And then the second point I had, because was I appreciate the response to the question because I know there was public testimony about parking for people with disabilities and how that would work as we move away from requiring parking, which I think is a good goal of the city. Whether there are concerns for people with mobility disabilities in sites that wouldn't have parking, and I'd like to continue talking about that more.
We could be sure to include that both in that November 13th as it relates both to the parking and the visitability topic. Thanks.
So, connected to what Andrea, sorry, Katie, said, but just since it's right on that topic, that FAR bonus for 3-bedroom units. I actually hear the bonus for 3-bedroom units as an exchange for the full unit is working well in some situations for developers, and they're actually putting that into play with their solutions. What I'm concerned about with this proposal is just having some research on it would be helpful. We used to have in the central city a FAR bonus for 3-bedroom units in some locations. I don't remember if it was just limited or if it's everywhere, and that didn't get much uptick. So just understanding of, is this similar to that one that wasn't really being used much? And just kind of making sure that we're trying to figure out a program that actually does incentivize the 3-bedroom units. So just something to think about. Katie?
Sure. Yeah, I have a list. I'll go through them quickly. Just that there were a couple of testimonies from people who were concerned about the changeover from R2 to the new, and they were going to be losing a lot of their ability. According to them, they were going to be losing a lot of their ability to develop. And it was pretty compelling testimony, so I kind of want to hear more about that. And maybe they were wrong. Let's see. And then I am concerned about parking. I have a difficulty with this one because I think it'd be great if we could get rid of all parking. But when I was on the Park Rose School District, we put in a high school without having any lockers because there was not supposed to be any more books. You know, everybody was going to have CDs. And then kids were, having trouble with their backs because they were carrying all their books around all day. So it just seems analogous in a way to this approach we're taking with parking. So more about parking, and I don't know if I don't know how you can help me with that really, but and then East Portland specific. I really like the idea of the open back end of the sites. A couple of things though that came up in those sessions was security. So for security, a lot of times they're going to be building fences. So then you've got these back ends that people won't be able to walk through. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know what we can do about that, but connectivity is so important there. And so that's going to stop the connectivity. And that people pointed that out, and they were also worried about security in terms of having campers in their backyard and things like that. So just a little bit more about that, how to get around that. And I'm not sure. And then you did mention that they would, but I think this is a connection with Pbot, which is there going to be more than just the fact that you would count their FAR? I'm not sure if I'm saying this right. Is there going to be more of a bonus to put in a street beyond just the fact that you wouldn't be penalized for it? Is there going to be some other way to make sure that people do take the next step of putting in a street?
We can invite Denver Igarda, the project manager for Pbot's work, to participate in that discussion.
Okay, I think that's it.
Chris? No? Wow. Yeah. Go ahead, Ben.
In terms of topic, when we get to the work sessions, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the calibration of some of the new requirements, in particular the minimum density as well as the visitability requirements. And with the concern of is the bar set in the right place? Is it going to be more of a barrier to reach that threshold, cross that threshold, or is it too high or too low? I just wanted to understand a little bit more about the rationale behind it.
Thank you. I should encourage you to take a look at some of the attachments we sent last week, including some analysis of some of the visibility standards costs, because it relates to some of these topics. And I should mention too that we'll have a little time to parse out the very specific issues or potential changes for October 9th and 13th, but September 25th, I again really encourage you to get as specific as possible as the changes or specific issues you'd like to discuss related to the topics we have. So the multi-dwelling FAR and scale and the bonus and transfer provisions. As soon as we can start lining up the decision points, the better. We'd like to be able to send things out to you by next Tuesday, I believe. So not a whole lot of time. Again, really encourage people to, if you haven't shared everything you want to discuss, you definitely get it to us by the 14th.
Okay. Pardon?
I have one for this list, I realize.
Okay, so Andreas has his hand up, then you can have a go, and then I just have one quick comment, and I think we'll probably be good.
Something I forgot to mention in the displacement analysis, it analyzes the displacement assessment for the proposed change, but I was wondering if we could get an idea of the change from current to proposed. So what is the displacement risk with the current zoning, and what is the displacement risk with the proposed zoning? So we'd have more of a comparison of seeing exactly what's changing between the two.
We can get back to you with that, some information.
I figured that out.
Eli?
This I think might be on the September 25th list. There's maybe a half dozen places in the code where it says these are the rules unless the property has a house, attached house, duplex, or manufactured home on it, which is sort of a way of the code getting at if it's zoned multi-dwelling, but it's functionally single dwelling development, the rules are different. And I think that there might be opportunities to winnow out that language to say it really is more of a continuum, and you don't have to have different rules for the same site, whether there's something legally defined as an attached house on it versus a triplex or fourplex.
Thank you.
And then I've given you my comments except for one, and I believe it's what you're getting at with your bullet point of spectrum of residential zones, is as I was going through this material most recently, was trying to really put together in my head, where are we at with RIP, and where does this overlap? And I'm sure that's your plan on walking us through that.
Yes, looking at the
Fabulous.
spectrum, the density allowances, and the full spectrum.
That'll certainly be helpful. And then I guess as a part of that conversation is, as we've made these proposed changes with RIP, which you might get more tonight, we'll see, or today, you know, how that adjusts or reflects your thinking on the proposal. Does it change anything? So I would love, your staff's input on that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. If not, I can clarify more later. And then my only last comment is the visitability analysis. I did go through that. I found it a little confusing myself, so I guess my hope is you're going to walk us through that as a part of that bullet point.
Yes. And and other issues related to the fact that we're making it mandatory in the multi-dwelling zones rather than being a bonus.
Great. Appreciate that. That's all I have. Any other last comments? Nope. Thank you very much, Bill and Tom.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Next item on the agenda is the residential infill project.
Good afternoon. My name is Sandra Wood. I'm with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and with me today is Morgan Tracy, the project manager for the residential infill project. And we are here for a work session for the residential infill project, our last one in a while with the commission. If members of the public are following along online and watching this, we wanted to share that the PSC materials that will be used for today's work session are available on our website. And they're also available for members of the public who are here, and we have paper copies in the back. We wanted to share today's agenda too. So today is a work session on the residential infill project. It's the last one in a while. And what we have for you today is a revised proposal of what your work sessions have been leading up to. And just to get everybody on the same page, what the commission has been doing is listening to staff's proposal and having straw votes amongst the commission, or straw polls, I should say, to ascertain whether there was general support in the commission for staff's proposal, or if there wasn't general support for staff's proposal, if any commissioner had any potential amendments that they would like to explore with the commission, and there were straw polls on those also to see if there was general consensus or not around those amendments. What we've done is taken all of those work sessions and those straw polls and put the summary together, which is in front of you. So I want to make sure that commissioners have the revised summary with a draft dated September 5th of 2018. And we've regrouped our the proposals based on the commission's straw polls, and Morgan will be walking you through that today. So what we're looking for today is really an understanding of the 12 amendments we have. You can take a look at the package of amendments and decide and take a look at whether that is really meeting the goals of the comprehensive plan and advancing the goals of the comprehensive plan as much as you want to take this project. There are some critical components. So of the 12 amendments, 3 are really critical for our next steps. So staff's next steps would be to take the direction we're receiving from the commission today and starting our technical analysis. And the first piece of our technical analysis is to rerun the economic study with our economic consultants. And the inputs that go into that economic study are the number of units allowed per single-family residential lot, the map. So in other words, the A overlay map that we've been discussing and how big it is or how small it is, and the structure size, because what we learned from the last economic study was that the size of the structure and the maximum FAR greatly affected the redevelopment potential of the lots. So as we walk you through the 12, I wanted to make sure that you're really honing in on the first proposal number 1 and proposal number 2. So units, the map, and structure size, those are the ones that we really have to get right at this point. We understand that the commission's formal vote is not until later in the fall. And if you had second thoughts about parking, visibility, everything else in the proposal, then those could be made later, but these are the ones that we're really hoping to hone in on today. 3 commissioners are not here today, and we asked them to share their thoughts with us because this is a moment in time, and we received feedback from Commissioner Backrack, and you all have those on your sheet, and we'll try to bring those up during the discussion too, so members of the public can hear what he had to say. We did not hear from Commissioner Hauk or St. Martin's. So that's the information we have today. Before Morgan walks us through the proposals, I thought it would be useful for Joe to remind the commission of the conversation you had about goals. And there are many goals in the comprehensive plan, but you had that great conversation early on in our work sessions about what goals you're trying to achieve with this package of amendments. So as we move through the package today, you can keep those in mind. Joe?
Great. Thank you, Sandra. This is just a repeat of a discussion we've had several times to get us back grounded on the goals, the priorities that you all set for yourselves at the front end of the project. And at this point, we're using this to take a look at how the package holds together. The top priority was to find ways to increase housing options, and there's a variety of specifics that were underneath that. And when you look at the proposal today, you'll see that it has done a lot of that. That's a place where the Commission has pushed the whole proposal significantly farther than where we started. Less expensive options was the idea of the smaller units and more supply. I think you'll see that reflected in there as well, with some change since the place we started, which is we're allowing flexibility in the unit size as the number increases. The equitable benefits and costs is one where we had proposals and counter proposals and sort of a difference of opinion on the Commission about how to evaluate, how to consider that. Do you block off parts of town, or do you trust on treating the dilution of kind of the impact in the market from treating more of the city in the same way across the board? As we move forward, we're going to be wanting to make the case about these back to City Council too as we take the whole proposal forward. So just wanted to refresh us and keep that in mind.
So before we move on, I think it's what we're really trying to emphasize here is there are three critical components that we need to nail down today. There's some elements in the proposals which we have room to move when the Commission sees the full revised proposal later this fall. But what we're seeking today is really whether this package of revised proposals is coming close to achieving the goals that you've agreed on. So with that in mind, the original proposal was presented as three topic areas: scale of houses, housing choices, and narrow lots. Based on the PSC's direction and amendments to date, staff consolidated and reorganized the project topics. We've combined housing options and scale, as these two are now tied to each other. This topic also includes narrow lots, as these narrow lots present an additional housing option, which is fee simple, smaller scale home ownership opportunities. There are also a number of proposals that relate to building design that we've consolidated into their own topic. In terms of the materials we'll be working through, so what we provided to the Commission earlier was what we call a strike through and underline version, which is just the language in our project summary, which showed the areas of proposals that were deleted and proposals that were added through your discussions and work sessions. We've consolidated all that information, reorganized it, like I mentioned, into this version, which is the housing options and scale. It's a two-pager that we'll be walking through. So the revised proposal leads off with the allowing for more housing types, including duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and additional ADUs. In the case of a house, we'd allow for 2 ADUs, and a duplex, we'd allow for 1. We have a 2-step lot size threshold to ensure that lots with more units are of a adequate size that can meet development standards and allow for feasible development scenarios. On lots with natural resources, hazards, or lack adequate infrastructure, the current allowances for ADUs with a house or corner lot duplexes are being maintained. So in essence, the existing allowances will remain in place there.
You know, just as we go through today, let's just confirm too that everybody's tracking, because really what today is the compilation of all these decisions you've made. So it should look like the story that you thought that we had been building along the way.
So this might be the time to share Commissioner Bachrach's comment.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and perhaps one thing that's been going through back of my mind is has the goals for any of the commissioners evolved or changed through this process? And I guess that would be an important thing for us to understand is, and somewhat seeing where Commissioner Bachrach's comments have come from have led me to believe that he may have somewhat adjusted his own thinking from where it was when he first started. So I guess just we don't have to, or if people had a way to comment on that right now, that might be helpful to hear. If not, I'd say let's just jump straight into Commissioner Bachrach's comments on this.
Okay, just to share Commissioner Bachrach's comments for the record here. He mentioned while he believes the RIP package the PSC has pieced together over the last couple of months is a strong planning concept, he's come to believe it needs to be streamlined and scaled back in order to make a more practical and implementable code amendment package. So in particular, with the allowing for more housing types, um, he believes that allowing fourplexes is a step too far. The possibility of 4 units on a single-family lot is an antagonizing talking point that risks undermining the package. He's now leaning towards staff's original concept of triplexes on corner lots and duplexes elsewhere, looking for acceptance of 2 or maybe 3 units on single-family lots and making it as simple as possible to build them, and then see what happens over the next few years, where the future BPS and PSC can look at increasing the allowed density. So when we're talking about for allowing more housing types, Jeff had a different position to introduce there.
Is there any additional comments or thoughts, or are we supportive of the? I'll just kind of open it up for discussion. Why don't we just go around and Ben, any thoughts? Don't feel like you have to speak, but if you want to share.
My first thought when I think we first started putting together amendments was to go for 3. I've always been kind of somewhat agnostic between 3 and 4. I do agree that it's kind of hard to fit 4 units in a 5,000 square foot lot, but it's not impossible. So in my mind, kind of leaving that option open, understanding that it won't necessarily be happening all the time. I'm kind of interested in kind of in leaving it as it is.
Great. So I was one of the people that voted for 3 for the triplex approach before, and part of it's based on sort of a natural sort of comfort with the idea of a house, an internal ADU, and an external ADU, and that gave me 3 units, and then I was okay with 2 in the backyard type of thing. I do think that the fourplex is a bigger burden on, it's a bigger lift. Clearly, I think it's potentially, as we're asking the single-family neighborhoods to transition, it's a big change. I'm concerned that, part of the analysis, I think, was, you used to have bigger households, so you're not necessarily introducing a lot more people, but I think as we divide them into different units, you have more separate households, and you're more likely to have more adults and more cars and that sort of situation, where I thought your locker comparison was great, that, we, at some point, everybody will have an iPad and there won't be these books, but we're not there yet, and right now the kids have back problems. And I think the threeplex also helps sort of clarify that distinction between the single-family neighborhoods and the multifamily, that it just seems a more natural break to me.
I'm really, the fourplex seems like it was an overreach when you get to scale, and the fourplex looks like a multifamily dwelling. I kind of started, let's do something simple and then see how it goes and then move forward, limit it. So I'm really at the area of, I'd like to see it scaled back, but I also understand, there's a push to provide a lot of options, and I don't know the options are getting us to the goals that we're setting in front of us, and that's my dilemma. Is I don't know that it's pushing a lot on the residents in neighborhoods, and it's doing it awfully fast, and I expressed that early on in this process, and I still kind of hold that view.
I'm going to think back to a lot of the motivations behind this project was to respond to a lot of public frustration around a few things. One of them is how big homes were. The other is how infeasible and financially and legally to build smaller homes in whole swaths of the city. And also a frustration we didn't have enough tools to preserve existing homes. And I think that this code, and stretching beyond what staff originally proposed, goes a long ways towards these things. And I get that we're a policy-making body, a policy recommending body, and after us it goes to a political body. And I think that as a policy standpoint, allowing up to 4 units is just fine. I think that it's rarely going to be done because there's a lot of things you have to do. It triggers ADA, visitability would apply, the homes would have to be quite small. And based on past experience, when people could have built fourplexes, as they could have in most of the city, what are now single-family zones before we adopted single-family zoning. They didn't get built. So I think having that option on the table is fine and won't be used very much. And I think that it does feel to me, even as a supporter of lots of housing options, that it is a big reach from what the code is now. But I think it's a good policy direction. And I think that one of Bacharach's points is that he wants to allow houses to be a little bit larger and less option for fewer homes. And I get concerned that if you do that, people can just keep building the status quo. And there's a lot of frustration with the status quo out there right now. And we got a chance to adjust those incentives. So I like the staff's, I like what's in the section right now. Thanks.
I think on the number of units, I'm a little bit agnostic. I think I really appreciate anchoring the conversation in goals, and I think the density is an important goal. I think it's a direction that the city needs to be taken. I think there's a lot that was presented about how single-family zones came to be and the historic background of how we have these areas of town. And another thing I appreciate coming back to the goals the PSC set at the beginning is 7 commissioners mentioned equitable benefits and costs. And from the sheet, at least, it looks like that got more specific mentions than any other specific goal. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm proud of the work we've done. I think we have taken the proposal, which was already at a good place, and made a lot of changes that I appreciate to it. But there are areas where I don't see this as a document that champions equitable benefits and costs. I think we've considered them. I think that there's a lot that's been done. But I think that there have also been some areas where we could have done a lot more. And from the original proposal, I regret the loss of connecting an increase of either FAR or unit size to an affordable unit or fee in lieu. I think that there is a true missed opportunity of taking advantage of having funding streams be created through this that could lead to equitable units or programming. And I think that that's an area where I really wish that we had been able to do more. And I guess that's the most specific thing I have on this.
Yeah, I voted against the 4 originally, and I still kind of feel like it's too much. But I would definitely go for it if I felt like it was of benefit to nonprofits who are trying to build low-income housing. That would be something that I would support.
So I think Eli was about to say that he'd made the point all along the way that the fourplex option may help nonprofits be more competitive in bidding for property. So, right. So, so the way I feel about this is that there's a distinction between what may happen and what is likely to happen. And part of what we're doing here is expanding the envelope of may so that perhaps we grow that core of likely a little bit. So I understand some people may see a fourplex as extreme. I think Commissioner Houck has made the point, and I'll channel him a little bit since he's not here, that he lives in a fourplex in what is essentially a single-family neighborhood, even though it's in a zone that we'll be considering under BHD. But the surrounding houses are single-family. The fourplex he's in fits in perfectly. There's no discontinuity. I think we have. I talked about earlier that well, what do the neighbors have to be afraid of, and is it buildings, people, or cars? I think if it's buildings, we've done a lot to limit the size of buildings. Maybe according to Commissioner Bacharach, a little too much. But I want to point out that we did not allow any FAR bonus for the 4th unit. So if a building becomes a fourplex, it will be no bigger than if it were a threeplex. So if that's what people are concerned about, I think that's not a big consideration. And again, I'm for letting as many people live in these neighborhoods as we can. So if the 4th unit is about getting another person in, that's great. Let's do it. And if it's about cars, well, I will point out that we have done very little in this package to limit parking. There are a few, alley configuration, other things where we said, you shouldn't put parking here. But in general, we're still allowing people to build parking. The market can still determine how much parking gets built with these. And, ultimately, in all of Portland, we're going to have to face up to the fact that, there will always be more demand in any neighborhood that's reasonably dense. There will always be more demand for on-street parking than there are on-street parking spaces, and you deal with that by setting up a permit system and setting up rules for who gets access to those on-street parking spaces. And whether we do 3-plexes or 4-plexes here is not going to change that equation. So I am basically comfortable with where we are. I think to kind of looking for an intersection between points, Commissioner Backrack's comments about maybe wanting to allow a little bit larger house, to Andre's comments about not having a revenue stream for affordability, I would be okay if we wanted to sell another 0.1 FAR for some fee in lieu that would go to affordable housing. I could get behind that as a compromise. I don't know if there's a meeting of the minds that could happen here around that, but that would be one way to address that, although I'm perfectly comfortable where we're at. But if other people feel the need to move, that might be a direction that I could get behind moving to. And I will also echo Eli's points that we're a policy body. Council gets to deal with the politics of this. And if, I think we should support 4 units because it's good policy. If council decides that's too much to swallow and they take it out, I'll be disappointed, but I think, we'll still have a very good package. So I would encourage us not to put too much weight on, the sort of getting it adopted piece. Let council sweat the 4-plex in that context.
Chris stated it well. I agree with what he stated. So you're going to have a pretty close vote here. I guess, where in my conversation with Jeff, because he and I talked through his concerns and comments, and I encourage him obviously to share them with us all, was that I feel like I really need the economic analysis to truly understand the impact. Mm-hmm. And I guess so maybe my question to you is, if we were to get an economic analysis that we find troubling, and if we started at 4 and then backed off to 3, is that an easier job to kind of run that analysis than it is to be running it at 3 and try to guess what 4 means? Or is it possible to run it at both and let us go from there?
I think it would probably be better to run it at 4. I mean, we know what we ran and what we presented to the commission, which was 2 and 3 on the corners. We know what that yielded, and it seems like the commission's, based on that economic analysis, decided that that's not enough production of units that you would like to see. So we know 4 will go a lot further in that regard. The FAR was one of the main components that really changed the uptake of those units and what would be yielded for that. So as a plan A was that you would all agree to something today. So now our plan B possibly is to run the economic analysis at 4, and then you would know what window, at least we have the bookends. And then you would know that 3 would be in between.
Well, so, like I said, without St. Martin's kind of weigh in here, we're at a 4-4, I think, tie, because I'm pretty sure Mike's a 4.
Yes, yeah.
So, like I said, that would be my suggestion. If the rest of the commission's comfortable with that, is that we move forward with that. And then, like I said, maybe perhaps if you have that prepared sooner than our final vote meeting would be to share that, and we need to find a way to have that discussion on that, if that's helpful.
Does that make sense, Joe, to you? Why don't we continue on through them, because the FAR might be the same. So if we have, maybe we do
fair
the bookend for the FAR too. We don't want an economic analysis that's completely way far off. Yep. Because we're trying to turn that around and submit it and to support your package of amendments. So I get that there's a chicken and an egg situation.
Andreas, you had your hand up.
I'm wondering if when we run the economic analysis to see what this proposal could look like, if we could also update the displacement analysis to just account for any changes that have been made in the proposal.
Can I weigh in this too, on the displacement analysis?
Well, I
This
think
is something that I've been meaning to bring up for a RIP.
what will be different depending on your third component of critical pieces is the map. So the economic analysis we looked at subtracted those areas that we had as displacement risks. So when we see those numbers, we'll see potentially what the rate of change is in those areas. So to that degree, we can report back.
So I had been thinking about the economic analysis about anti-displacement, and I just had noticed that the Better Housing by Design had an anti-displacement study that was a lot more detailed and richer than the one that went with RIP. And I was kind of wondering about that, and wondering if the RIP one could be updated to be of the as strong as the displacement study for Better Housing by Design. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, we understand. We were generation one on the displacement analysis, and so the work that Tom and Bill and Tyler have done, they learned from residential infill. They improved it with Better Housing by Design. So we'll get to coordinating with them. I'm not sure what all that will entail.
Sure.
But I hear you on that, yeah.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The other piece that the economic analysis feeds into is, of course, the transportation impacts and whether our infrastructure system can support the quantity of development that we anticipate seeing in the next 25 years, or if you have to amend the project list in the comprehensive plan to support some of those transportation improvements. So it all, all of it has to be reanalyzed before we get to City Council.
Yep.
So this was a good discussion today. It didn't resolve this issue, but I think actually, as much as anything, what I read when I read Commissioner Bachrach's testimony, it's a heightened concern about getting a package adopted is sort of what I got from it. So we're going to be able to look at these different impacts that you have asked for and determine if the margin between 3 and 4 advances the goals that we're trying to accomplish with this project, or is just not worth the effort. When you get to City Council, one way this plays out differently is the people who are going to, the level of concern is going to be heightened, and the worst possible case of what could be built under whatever we're bringing forward is going to be the thing that City Council sees the most often, because that's just sort of the way the rhetoric of these work. So we just got to make sure that even the time devoted to discussing that kind of option is worth it. We need to see the traffic, we need to see displacement, we need to see how it's going to affect the economics of demo. So we can bring it back.
I just received a text from Commissioner Houck. Second here, and he's kind of rubbing it in that he's in Scotland. Besides that fun little fact, he did say that he does want us all to know that he supports the RIP package as it currently stands. He didn't imply that, but he did say he had read Jeff's note and wanted to make sure, having read that we all understood kind of where he stands.
Great. Moving.
A question. So, in terms of the economic analysis, I like the idea of analyzing 4, but does it make sense? I mean, if we know either fellow commissioners or city council are going to want to see what 3 looks like, should that just be like alternatives to scope? So you don't have to redo it again?
No, it's all built in, I believe. I'll double check.
So if you do 4, you're going to find out about 3 also?
Just remember, the thing that made the most difference was the size of the structure.
Yeah, so we're not changing
units.
size.
So I fully expect 3 and 4 to be and just like your all's gut is that we'll hardly ever see for. I bet that proves to be true economically as well. It does make that much difference, but we'll find out. Okay.
And as Joe mentioned, the most important thing. So the next proposal here is limiting the overall size of structures on a lot. What we're really setting out to do is set a maximum floor to area ratio that's less than what is achievable today. So what you can build today, you wouldn't be able to build with the new FAR limits. The FAR would scale to increase with the additional units on a lot. We're continuing to exclude attics and basements from that FAR. We would allow an increase or a bonus in the FAR if at least one of the units is affordable or an existing house is retained and converted to allow for additional units. We also have a provision in here to allow for flexibility and allow the houses to adapt over time and allow for a little bit of the implementation ease of applying FAR by allowing for a small addition every 5 years, a 250 square foot addition. So I got a couple more slides to walk us through here on this topic. This next table is repeated in your revised summary, but basically shows the different FARs assigned to each of the different zones and how that FAR increases with the duplex, increases with the triplex or fourplex, and the additional 0.1 FAR bonus that you get when you're retaining a house or providing an affordable unit. This example just shows a typical 5,000 square foot R5 lot and how those sizes would play out. So a 2,500 square foot house, for instance, a house that adds an ADU or is built with an ADU or a duplex would be allowed 3,000 square feet. A house with 2 ADUs, a duplex with the 1 ADU or a triplex or a fourplex gets up to 3,500 square feet or 0.7 FAR. The bonus here would provide for an additional 0.1 FAR when you're retaining the existing house or providing for that affordable unit. So in one instance, one of the things that Commissioner Backrack had some concern about, and I think we had some discussion with the commission on, was, okay, if you're a house and you're adding an ADU and you're going to be above that 3,000 square feet, does that mean we don't get an ADU? So in this case, when you have an existing house and you're adding the ADU, because you're retaining the house, you get that bonus 0.1 FAR. So this was one way of getting to his concern about setting the FAR so low that might make it impractical for some of those situations. So I think that's what I've got for our FAR discussion.
Do you guys just want to go around again, or why don't we just go with our round?
Sure.
What time do we've got?
Let's go around. Maybe not exactly the same point as Jeff's, but I do share some of those concerns. Reiterated them before. I think this is a bold package. I think it goes quite far. I do agree in principle of a need to reduce the overall FAR allowance. I am wondering whether we're going a bit too far. In general, I'd be more comfortable if we pegged it at just below half of what it is today. So, for instance, on the R5, it's 0.35, 1.35 today. We're proposing 0.5. I think if we stay at 0.6 or below, I think in my mind, it kind of goes a little bit more in line with our more housing options. I feel like although some of the larger homes that we've seen, the 2,800-ish average home that's being built today had a strong impact and perhaps weren't really well designed. My point is that whether it's 2,800 or 2,500, I don't know that impact is really determined by the FAR. And we've been using that FAR discussion as a proxy for the scale. There is a relationship, obviously, but it's not that linear, and it has a lot to do with how you design the house. So in my mind, cramping it down to 2,500 as a base is a little bit too low, and again, takes out some of the flexibility that either larger families or whatever options, people sharing rooms. We talked about the number of kitchens, etc. So I would suggest to bump up that a little bit up, and then if we want to maybe create more of a stepped approach for the duplex and triplexes. Maybe an extra 0.1 might be a little bit too much. That's where maybe the economic analysis comes in, but maybe we just do a 0.05 or something like that.
Commissioner, can I clarify your intent? So I heard you clearly. You think taking the R5 example, 0.5 is too low as a base. Are you also saying 0.8 is too high as a cap, or are you just suggesting narrowing the range to 0.6 to 0.8 rather than 0.5 to 0.8?
Can you go back to the slide that we had earlier when we actually saw all those options? So if 3,500 square feet is the cap that comes with a 0.8,
well, you can get to 4,000 if
you can get to
apply
4,000
everything, right?
with the regulations that and again, we're not just talking about FAR. We changed the way we calculate the height. I think that's huge. So there's a whole package that comes together that really addresses the scale concerns that we had on the onset of this project that I think get to that. I'd be curious to see what the economic analysis says, but at the same time, I feel like we're already pushing some pretty bold ideas and kind of reconsidering really going too far on the FAR.
So to the economic analysis question on this type of example, are you comparing a 2,500 square foot house the way you're describing it here, which is, I understand it, we're just talking about stuff that counts for FAR, so the basement's not counting and the attic's not counting. Correct. So that 2,500 square foot house we see here could very easily be a 3,500 square foot house that looks exactly the same. So is the economic analysis somehow take into account that that these numbers actually reflect the possibility of a much bigger FAR? And if you don't know, that's fine. I think that we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about it, because again, I think we're not limiting the house to 2,500 square feet. There's much more square footage that's still achievable in this first example.
So I'm going to take that example and run it to a little bit of the extreme, the unlikely extreme, right?
Fair.
So there is virtually an unlimited amount of square footage you could build underground, right? We've seen single-story basements, and that's true. But I think the issue with the basement construction is it costs more to build, and it's worth less to sell. It's less daylight. It has potential moisture problems, et cetera. So it's less desirable square footage. So its value is less than above grade square footage. That's all hard to model on a citywide economic analysis. So we can have sort of qualitative descriptions about the potential for basement construction. What this might do is encourage more basements to be constructed because you're capping the size. But I'm not sure that the necessary change in value is going to be that much of a difference, considering all the additional costs and the lower value for that space.
Fair. What about the attic?
The attic, when we're talking about excluding the attic, it's really square footage that the building code doesn't consider as habitable anyways.
Yes, that's true. Right.
So
okay, fair
that
enough.
really is not valuable, sellable square footage.
Kat, my gut is, I'll have to go back and look, but I'm sure that it was based on market comparables. And so it's probably for that purpose of where that data comes from, they're looking at the stated square feet of a house and it may be typical in the marketplace that these other areas are there, but they're not, it depends on what gets rolled into that number that gets reported to RLMS. Yeah. So we'll go check with our database, but it's
that's
some margin. It's probably not as much as we think, but there's some margin.
Well, I think there's a lot of historic homes in the Portland area that have basements. We're not seeing them built so much today. It seems like newer homes aren't. So I guess, to that point, I think if you're comparing it to an older home in Portland, that's, I don't, you see what I'm getting at? That basement's actually being counted in that RLMS data.
It's a comparable. We got to take a look at what we really use for comparables to set these numbers. But
something to think about.
Yeah.
Sorry. Off track, Michelle.
So I guess I think that a newly designed home can be designed in a good way that you can get more out of the 2,500 square feet in terms of, avoiding hallways and just being sort of inefficient with your space. So I'm comfortable with the idea of reducing it. Frankly, I'm not tied to a specific number, so I could see going to, looking at what the market's been doing and say, okay, that's where we're going to cap it. But I'm also comfortable with the 2,500, so my vote is not really contributing anything to this discussion.
At the risk of diving into architectural areas, it seems that we started out with the premise of we wanted to control the size of the buildings that were being built, new structures, and that was a citizen's concern. I think we've done that. Whether or not the new buildings will be designed in an efficient way to look good is a different story, and we don't control that. So I'm comfortable at 2,500 square feet, but I do have the concerns of, are we creating another problem in the fact that if people really do want the space, do they just start going underground? And is that then, I don't know if the economic analysis looks at that, but for new structures, do we just start creating a lot of basements? And basements are great. I mean, I like basements, so I'm not against basements, let me be clear, but are we creating that issue and looking at how that is going to work also?
Well, I have a basement and love it. I just looked at a little headline. So it's from 2003. Today's new homes are 1,000 square feet larger than in 1973. This is 40 years later. And in 1950, the average size home was less than 1,000 square feet. And households were way bigger back then than they are today. So for all the talk about we can't fit into this 2,500 square foot house, I kind of think, well, we did for most of human history houses less than half that size. I also look at the carbon issues. Oregon has studied this more than any state. The biggest carbon impact of new construction over the lifespan of a house is how big it is. Because 70 to 80% of carbon impact of a house is heating and cooling the space, is conditioning the space. So if you have, one of the stats from the state is that if you take a 2,200 square foot house and you build it to base code, that's worse. 2,200 square foot house built to LEED standards, really high standards, is not quite as good as a 1,600 square foot house built to base code. Knock a little space off the house and you decrease your carbon footprint significantly. Attached housing is great for that also. And this code supports both those things, attached housing and smaller homes. So I think that there are some tricks to get more square footage. If you really want to have more space than 2,500 square feet, you can figure out ways to do it. You can create an ADU and put a relative in it, put your teenager in it. You can have a basement. There's tricks to do it if you really want it. But to set the norm that we have to have more space than that to live in, especially with the average size of households getting smaller, and even with large households, they fit within 1,200 square foot houses back in the day. I don't think this is really going too far.
Andres?
I feel like I have spent more sustained brain capacity on this project than few things in my life. And one of the areas that I have been focusing on a lot has been the size of the footprint, right? And the square footage. And since I heard of concerns around the 2,500 square feet, I really tried to understand what that meant. And it so happened to coincide with the process of searching for a home to purchase. I just looked up at the home we purchased on Redfin, and it is under 1,500 square feet above ground with a just under 1,000 square foot basement. And it feels massive. And every time we went to look at a home or saw a home listed, I never even came close to seeing a home that was 2,500 square feet above ground. And I understand that I don't have a family. I understand that I don't represent every single experience in Portland, but I really struggled and tried to understand 2,500 square feet above ground, excluding attics by right, being too small, and I think it was something I wasn't able to come to terms with in this project. I think that I really appreciate the approach we took in this project of increasing FAR by unit size. I think that design that we're looking at right now on the screen really matches the goals we have for density. I like Chris's proposal where if we want to sell extra FAR to secure funding for equitable projects, for affordable housing, for anti-displacement, whatever it may be, that if there is such a sustained interest in FAR and having that be accessible so people can build larger homes, then we should be having an offset that benefits the city in an equitable way. I appreciate the bonus FAR that we have included in this project. And to clarify, because I know that this has come up in the proposal and the conversation repeatedly, I understand that nonprofits who build affordable housing aren't going to be the primary customers of this product, that those aren't going to be the overwhelming developers taking advantage of it. And so I think that that's where I really had hope in a fee in lieu model or a unlock fee option, because that isn't limited to just affordable housing providers who are building it because they're mission driven or using tax credits. And that would really establish an equitable cash stream to fund initiatives that the city thinks are important related to housing in a way that was accessible to everyone. Obviously, it would have to be calibrated to the other considerations of the project, but I think as a model that's something that's really important that I wish was still in the proposal.
And I agree with Eli and Andres. I just think 2,500 square feet is really adequate. And if they want more, they can build a basement. And then in 40 years, it can be divided up and there will be 2 units there. So, yeah, nothing more to add.
And I'll simply co-sign everything Eli said.
I support the proposal as written. So that puts us at 6 on supporting the proposal. I don't know. What do you think then?
So just by way of sharing, so
yes, that's how I
Commissioner Backrack also commented primarily around the affordability issue. So allowing for the additional increase in FAR if at least one of the units is affordable. As the PSC came to recognize, RIP is not a realistic way to gain mandatory affordable housing, i.e. inclusionary housing. He would recommend we not clutter up the package with affordability requirements that are likely to be rarely, if ever, utilized. And the goal is to create opportunities for more housing types and density in single-family zones. There should not be added conditions imposed on people who are trying to do that.
But am I correct? It's not a condition, it's an option?
It's an option, yeah.
It's an option, correct. So looking at this proposal number 2 about the overall size of structures, looks like by today's thinking that setting the maximum FAR that less than what is achievable today, there was a lot of consensus around that. The scale of FAR to increase with more units. We didn't hear any differing opinions about that, so we're good there. Exclude attics and basements, good. And then allow an increase in FAR, and that's what the comment from Commissioner Backrack was about. And the last one, allowing for 250 square feet addition every 5 years. So this is an existing house and this was a little bit also in regards to how difficult it is to measure FAR. And if you have an existing house and you want to do a kitchen bump out, then we're sending people off to do full plans. This provision would allow for a 250 square foot addition, no questions asked. You get it? Commissioner Backrack had a comment about that. That's too small a limit on existing homeowners. I'm not sure what the sweet spot is, but something more than 250 square feet. One such, yeah. So no number. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, no, so it's a little bit, we're retreading what we just talked through. And so with the sense of the commission that we just got about the number being fine, these other sort of variations in there I think you've already covered them, just to offer that we don't have to rehash each of those
Don't
internal
want to
details.
go around the horn.
No, no.
I'm glad to.
And this is not one of the critical
but if there
components
was
that
something-
plays into our analysis. So it's just we can, you can ruminate on that.
And I was just reflecting, we brought the package back today to sort of try to show you where all of our votes landed and added up to, and the intent wasn't to relitigate the whole thing. However, it is the opportunity to reflect one more time on it, but the idea wasn't that you'd have to vote on every little clause in this. This is supposed to be reflective of what you've already told us that you want us to prepare.
Appreciate the direction. So just if anybody has anything they'd like to add to this. Go ahead, Andre.
Just on the affordability, I kind of beat that to death, but yeah, I'm not for the affordability. I'm kind of with Jeff. Can you remind us how we got to 250 square feet? Is there kind of some magic math, or is it just a number?
No, it's mostly just a number.
Okay.
It's a little bit based on, with the bonus, you're getting essentially 500 square feet, so we didn't want to provide this addition that was equivalent to a bonus. But we had to pick a number.
So great. Those are two of the big critical issues that we needed to discuss today. So I think the other ones are,
so I was just doing the little calculation, not that we couldn't do it in your head, but that's a pretty big room is all I'm getting at. 200? Yeah, 250 square feet.
Bigger than a two-car garage.
Huh?
Yeah.
Bigger than a two-car garage.
So, you can put a couple bedrooms in there. You can do a lot of things with 250 square feet.
Yeah, I'm fine with 250. It's 2 10 by 12 typical rooms, or a larger room with a bathroom or something like that. So for something that happens automatically, seems like a decent number.
Just so people can put that into their head visually. Okay.
Thank you. So that's 2 of 3?
2 of 3 critical items, yeah.
So here's number 3. So the PSC gave us direction that they would like to see these additional housing types offered in more areas of the city. So initially, we proposed an overlay that was about 66% of the R2.5 through R7 zones. This map reflects almost all of the R2.5 through R7 zones, minus the areas that are constrained with either natural hazards, natural resources, or infrastructure constraints. What's not mapped here, obviously, are the unpaved streets. So if you're on if you're a lot on an unpaved street, until that street gets improved, you wouldn't be able to do the additional housing types. But this reflects about 96% of those R25 through R7 zones.
So I feel like we really hashed this one out when we went over it.
Mm-hmm.
So also I think the floor is just open if there's anybody who wants to add additional commentary. Andre.
This is where I think Katie's comment on the displacement analysis and the impact of this overlay relative to what we anticipated previously and what that will be today with the overlay.
So what I'm hearing is you would like to see sort of a reevaluation of the displacement based on these additional housing types in those areas and what that potentially looks like.
And possibly second generation version of it.
Exactly.
Rather than our initial take on it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And just to add, it would be good to see what the displacement is without this in place. Do you know what I mean? Like both if it wasn't in those areas, what would happen? Because that was never really done. If you're getting down to the granularity, then you might as well do both sides of that.
I think
unless you just can't. But
so it's an understanding of situation today, which we think we have some
Which
information on, versus what this looks like it's projecting. But go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. So I don't want to overpromise what our economic group can do, because we're really splitting hairs, and that's exactly the right frame, Katie, is what you said. We know today sort of what's happening with the house price that's getting bid up on single-family houses. So we know what that value point is, right? Remember, we started this whole thing too with worrying about what the scrape point kind of cost is. Like, how much money can you make on buying a house and tearing it down and just replacing it with a house? That you're going to see that, and we determined that at 2,500 square feet, it'll be maybe less than it is today, but that depends on the market. So we hit a pretty sweet spot economically with the general kind of frame we've got. What we did originally, we said where there was concentrations of renters, we were going to try to exclude them. But what we didn't do when we did that analysis was to say, you know, even in the yellow areas we had back when we had areas excluded, there are lots of renters. And so the question then becomes, is this incidence of a house being torn down and redeveloped, either for a bigger single-family house or a duplex or a triplex or a four-flat, more likely to happen on a rental property than it is on a home, and a lower-income rental property than not? So that's going to be a little bit hard to separate out, but we can compare it with sort of the direction things are going today. And I think what we're going to have to get our heads around is how I think we're going to be able to come up with comparable numbers of how the overall rents and prices, given these different types of development, are going to affect the likelihood for redevelopment to happen. I don't know that we'll know if it's more likely on what kind of tenure the house has. Does that make sense? Like, I don't think I can tell you it's going to happen more likely for a renter than an owner, but we can say if the baseline price of a house is in this range, so as you go out in rings of value, it's more likely to happen there. It's that kind of scale is what I believe we're going to have. Yeah.
So,
but we can give it a run. That's good.
As a part of that thinking, though, so if we're finding, and just help me if this thought process is wrong, if you're finding that there is an incentive to bring a house down, let's say, and put up 3 units, is there anything we can do to figure out, well, do those 3 units become rental units and what would the rent? I mean, you know, versus what,
I would say
like,
not
you know,
anymore.
like a wash or not.
No, we've really, it's complicated. Well, I want to go back and ask actually experts in it, but it's more complicated now that we're allowing those lots to be divided.
Right.
It's a lot's a lot. And it's not like the house on the lot didn't have increasing value to start with.
Right.
So that same renter, or the same low-income renter, mostly the most vulnerable household, is under risk right now. And I'm not really sure. I worry, you know, so that we just have
Fair.
to run the
Yeah.
numbers.
Right.
Sorry.
Chris?
Katie, you brought up a great point of this, how this is presented. The one question is, when some houses are going to be taken down no matter what. So one of the questions is, baseline, under current rules, what would be built there versus under ritual, what would be built there? And we've heard a lot of concern about one-for-one house replacements, and almost all the new homes getting built right now on single-family lots is a big house. So one of the comparisons is how, if under current rules we have a good idea of what's getting built and can project that forward, how would it be different under these rules? And related to presentation on the last one we just talked about, sorry to go back in time for just a minute, but the 250 square foot, this the way it's written is allow existing houses to expand by up to 250 square feet, and I believe that maybe we should present that as up to 250 square feet larger than what otherwise would be allowed, because if you have a 1,500 square foot house, you can build 1,000 square feet by right, correct?
Correct.
And then another 250 beyond that. So I think that most older homes that you're doing the addition to, you actually have a whole 1,000 square feet to play with before you even run into this provision. So it'd be nice to just present it so that people don't have, it's easy to interpret that, well, this is what it says, you only build 250 square feet to your house. Most houses are way smaller than 2,500 square feet.
Yes, and I guess there's 2 components to that. If you are at 1,500 square feet and you want to do a 250 square foot addition, we won't ask you for the FAR of your full house. So there's the regulatory simplicity of how we're going to implement it, but then you're correct. Yeah, they can go up to 2,500. Go ahead.
So through this process, I pretty much pushed staff to find every square inch that we didn't have a legitimate objection to including in this map. And I did that recognizing that the anti-displacement folks told us, you know, the right way to treat displacement is not to limit the development opportunity, but to deliver anti-displacement programs where they're needed. So it's a programmatic solution rather than a regulatory solution. You know, the question I still worry about is, well, what happens if council doesn't fund any of those programmatic solutions? And Um, you know, if that were the case, I would probably be inclined to go back to something more like the amendment that Commissioner Baugh extended, which was basically only do this in the neighborhoods that have already experienced the full load of displacement. Um, yeah, I hope this commission will be very vocal with council talking about the need to have those programmatic solutions. And Katie and I had drinks the other night, and we're talking about our Southwest Corridor housing strategy, where we basically said, well, if you're not going to do the housing strategy, maybe you shouldn't build a light rail line. I think there's a certain element of, if you're not going to do good anti-displacement programs, maybe we shouldn't do RIP in this form. So I support this map, but it also includes a hope that council is going to do the right thing, and I think we need to invest some energy in getting council to do the right thing. So that's my comment.
Go ahead.
This conversation of displacement, I think there's two parts to it. One is, I agree, we need to have a full package of anti-displacement programs and fully implemented and doing things. But the other is, if we confirm that there is an increased risk, then how do we look at that as a policy group against our housing policies and a number of other policies that we have? To me, it brings in, we're going to have a different type of discussion of, are these properties more valuable, whether they're renters or non-renters? And if they're more valuable, the likelihood that they turn over, I don't know. But it seems logical that if you increase the capability of a property to generate money, that it would probably be more valuable. I mean, that's just illogical. And so what is the probability of that happening? I don't know. But if you take the same conversation we had with IZ and look at that conversation, I think you have a very robust conversation coming around whether the policy of displacement here and whether or not we as a PSC say it's okay to have a higher risk of displacement if that is truly the case, or we rely on council for something else.
Eli, Andreas, and Joe.
Well, there's some analysis to be done. I think that there's a high likelihood that this RIP policy will be an anti-displacement policy because it creates, I mean, a lot of homes are going to come down no matter what, and we'll see what happens. But if a home gets replaced by 3 or 4 homes that are a lot less expensive to rent or to own than what being built under current rules, I think that's a good thing. And we got strong feedback from nonprofits working all over the city, close in areas and further out cities, supporting these housing options in their neighborhoods. And I think that they know that stuff pretty well. So I'm happy to see the verdict, but I recognize that the residential infill project is too discrete a scale, the homes, to try and get much, if any, regulated affordable housing. Only a small amount is likely to come through this project. But to create more homes that are smaller and less expensive than the market would otherwise build under today's rules, I think there's a high prospect there, which is encouraging.
I agree with Eli that the net effect will be that the homes that will be built, if they're smaller, are likely to be more affordable. I think that shouldn't prevent us to think about who is living in the homes that are being torn down and what is happening to those people next. And so I think there's where the disconnect comes from. I like Chris's idea of saying without the anti-displacement programs, we should think twice about this project. I like the idea of looking back to Andre's previous amendment of focusing it on a narrow area. I also think that it's worth considering a delay even if anti-displacement programs are created, because I think it will take time to get people on the ground and to make a difference in programming. And if the zoning goes into effect immediately and we start seeing development and people approaching owners to buy their property immediately, then the fact that we also had anti-displacement programs go into effect at the same time doesn't help. if they aren't able to reach people before development does. And so I think that that should be considered.
Any other comments? Michelle?
Just a question to go back. So did we end up leaving the 100-year floodplain out?
Yeah, 100-year floodplain's out.
Okay, so just, I don't know if you can deal with it at this stage or not, but knowing based on the BES work that at least in the Johnson Creek area, we don't think the mapping is necessarily correct. I'm just curious if there's some way to address that with elevation certificates or something so that we're in this strange situation where we're going to tell people you can't do this based on you being in the floodplain, but you're actually potentially not, and people can in a location where they actually are. So I'm just wondering if you go to a surveyor and you're able to come in and show something that says, look, I'm this high, if there's a way to deal with it. And it may be that at this stage we can't, but I want to mention it.
Okay. We'll check on that. And of course, if they come in and they're in the 100-foot floodplain, they still have to comply with Title 24 and elevate the living space outside of that. So I'd like those to be the same, like whatever, if they can get out of that by doing a certification, then maybe that's something we can tie into our code provisions too.
So, I mean, I'll just give a quick update. I was the one that had some of the floodplain amendments. Staff and I had a long conversation about it, and I just said I would withdraw. I don't know that we ever actually talked about this publicly. I would withdraw those amendments and let staff work on it with that package that's going to be coming through with the floodplain work. Okay. I still have concerns about how we're measuring height and stories and all that for properties within the floodplain, but I'm quite happy letting us take on that challenge as we go through that other work. Okay. Eli?
And I would actually, in the way we've limited the geography, the first, fourth, and fifth wouldn't need a map for those, I think, because it's inventory. I guess if there were ways of achieving these goals without having to do a map at all, so that things could change without updating a map, flood zone is one of those classic cases. If we just said you're outside a flood zone, if that gets changed later on, it changes the impacted properties. That would be, I would welcome that kind of, not having to do a map at all. So it could, if more natural resources get identified, or if streets get paved that used to be unpaved, all of those things that might happen over the next 10, 20 years are going to create inconsistencies with whatever map we draw today.
Yeah, and we did take that approach for number 5, the unpaved streets. That's codified. It's not mapped on here, precisely for that reason. I think that's one of the things we'll be exploring as to, we've already been talking about, well, the A is on 96%, maybe the A gets flipped and it's on the sites where you can't do this. We want to provide some flexibility in zoning and for people who are thinking about purchasing property to look at the zoning designation and understand what's the development potential. It would be a big difference between a house and up to a 4-plex on a site. And there, so I think we're going to think about those customer service friendly zoning designations too. So it can mean something because people are making decisions pretty quickly and coming into the permit center to find out, oh, is this in the NRI, is it in a floodplain, is it in this and that. Makes it pretty cumbersome to make an offer on a property.
Any other comments? Katie?
Just wanted to thank my fellow commissioners for that discussion about displacement. You know, when we first talked about it, the conversation was a little rough, and I felt like this time we're coming to a kind of compassionate decisions about displacement and how we're going to deal with it. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Not seeing any. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
We're not
oh,
adjourned.
no, we're not.
But the good news is,
I've done this before.
the good news is those were the toughest parts of the questions to answer. So hopefully, hopefully the
How
rest
many more
of this
do we
will
have?
go. 12 total.
12 total, but the critical ones, we've gone through the 3 critical ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
So think of this as more of a reflection upon your past decisions, direction, and we're just sort of buttoning it all together to show you how it all came together. So
Can I encourage you just to keep flipping through the sides, and if anybody has anything they want to add when they see a slide come up, and to call out my attention. How about that?
great.
Great.
So requiring at least 2 units when your lot is double size, so just more efficient use of those larger lots by requiring a house with an ADU or duplex. We added, through this conversation, the R7 and R5 zones to that proposal. For 3 or 4 units, 1 unit must be visitable. We haven't really changed much in the way of those requirements except the exceptions. So we've added an exception when there's a steep slope between the street lot line and the front door to get it sort of those elevated lots and the harder to serve lots with a 0-step entry. And we'll keep our eye on that as it evolves through the Better Housing by Design discussions as well. The Commission also extended our proposal. They went along with the rezoning half of the narrow lots to R2.5 while allowing, so the change here is allowing the other R5 historically narrow lots to be confirmed for attached houses. Also allowing for small flag lots through property line adjustments. So where you have a historically narrow lot as a way to encourage encourage retaining existing houses, you can use a property line adjustment to move that lot line and create a small flag lot. The size of the house would be limited to 1,000 square feet and subject to the same sorts of design treatments that an accessory dwelling unit would be treated. In the R5 zone, the height of the house on the flag lot would also be limited to 20 feet like an accessory dwelling unit. So these two
Sorry, can I go back on that one? Sorry, I didn't catch this before. Didn't the Commission also decide to exempt the existing house from the FAR limits on the front lot?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that not in there?
I don't think that's in there.
Good point. So we'll clarify that. So these next 2 images show how this would play out in an existing block with several different types of situations going on there. The current R5 rules allow for lots to be confirmed, detached houses to be built on those if there's an existing house in place on that historically narrow lot. The lot has not been vacant. It would have to remain vacant for 5 years. Detached houses would be allowed on those corner lots through property line adjustment. Through the R25 rezone, we essentially allow for attached houses. You can see a couple examples of small flag lots where there's a pre-existing standalone narrow lot. A detached house would be allowed on that lot. For R5, it plays out somewhat the same, but a little bit differently. So the 5-year vacancy gives way to the attached house requirement. We still have the small flag lot option where you have more than 2 lots in a row, or actually odd numbers of lots. You're limited to pairs of attached houses in the R5 zone. So on that situation, the first situation, you would still have the ability to either put a house there, or duplex, 3-plex, or 4-plex. And finally, for the additional housing options and scale, this last proposal allows for added flexibility in building form and arrangement. This allows for added flexibility in site and building design through a discretionary plan development review. The thrust behind this proposal is putting plan developments on par with a similarly sized land division site in terms of their development allowances, requirements, and review procedures. So same types of FAR, same number of units, same level of review based on the number of units in that proposal.
So this is what the Commission talked about, equivalency, like whatever you can achieve through a land division, through a typical subdivision, be able to achieve it through plan development also.
All right, rounding the corner to building design. So this proposal looks at revising how height is measured. The Commission didn't give us any different direction on this, so no changes in the way we are proposing to change how height is measured. We've sort of consolidated some of the different proposals into one feature here, building features and articulation. We're talking about limiting how high the front door can be above the ground. We're exempting lots in floodplains because they have that requirement to elevate the door above the floodplain. Still allowing for 2-foot eave projections into setbacks, allowing the front setbacks to match the house next door. The key change here is we're not requiring, not proposing an increased setback in the R5 zone. And no longer requiring duplex front doors to face separate streets on corner lots.
Yeah.
The last one in Better Building by Design, they're requiring doors on the other separate streets. Is that correct?
Who is, Better Housing by Design?
Yes. So there's a difference here.
Is that right? Shannon will confirm it right now. So I think what we understood from the commission during our discussions, and we can confirm about Better Housing by Design, was that you didn't want to regulate where front doors were anymore, not for an ADU either, right?
Correct.
Right,
Yeah,
because
that
right
comes up
now,
next.
an internal ADU cannot have its door facing the street. It has to be on the side or on the back. So there was an amendment to that too. So I think what we understood, the overall philosophy is that you didn't want to regulate where front doors were, which could also mean that a fourplex could have 4 front doors facing the street.
There is still the requirement that at least one of the doors meet the main entrance requirement, so it either faces the street or opens up to a porch.
I'm just pointing out, I think there's a difference in Better by Design in here. I'm not.
So perhaps if when, we're looking at the comparison with residential zones next meeting, we'll have them.
Yeah, so we'll
check
work
that one
with
out.
Bill on that to add that to our list of standards.
Yep.
Perhaps any other standards that we might have monkeyed with that seem now different.
I think it's a different question. I think in the single-family zone is having maybe too many front doors facing the street. In the multi-dwelling zone, it's like having no front doors facing the street. So
Right.
multi-dwelling, they say you have to have one. Both zones say you have to have one door facing the street. The question is whether you could have more than that, I think.
Yep. So Sandra was just consulting. We have a growing matrix of comparative.
Right, remember this
development
matrix that we put together a long time ago? So we'll, poor Katie's like, oh.
We'll review that though. We'll
Just one row at a time. And then a breath.
And we'll go around the horn.
And then a breath.
So there was also direction from the commission to keep the current ADU rules in terms of their overall size, the detached accessory size, the heights of those detached buildings, except allow for basement ADU conversions to exceed the size cap in an existing house. So this was, again, another incentive for existing houses, give a little more flexibility to better utilize the basement. Sometimes the basements are larger than 800 square feet, and sometimes they're larger than 75% of the size of the main house. So just give them a little more flexibility. And as Sandra mentioned, allowing the front door of the internal ADU to also face the street. On the parking proposals, by and large, the commission went along with the staff's proposals. However, you added deleting minimum parking requirements for residential uses in single dwelling zones. So we had proposed removing minimum parking requirements for the duplexes and triplexes. This would apply to all residential uses in those zones. Finally, improving building design on lots less than 32 feet wide. Again, these have not changed since the proposed draft. So limiting the height of a detached house to 1.5 times its width, and requiring attached houses on lots that are 25 feet wide and narrower. In our conversations along the way through our work sessions, there were other possible recommendations to make to City Council. There was another one that Chris just introduced today. Those include parking permit tools, curb cut fee or tax, looking at building code requirements or mandates for visitable houses, a more streamlined partition process, looking at tree code, a separate tree code project to address small lot development, and at least addressing the issue about SDC waivers and when they apply. This sort of all revolves around the ADU conversation. Is it the ADU that's really the thing that everybody's after, or is it really about the SDC waivers? So that's a conversation that City Council needs to have. And of course, today we were just talking about the anti-displacement programs and communicating the importance of that. So we also heard at our, I think it was the August 14th work session, that we don't need to think about all these and decide now. This is sort of when we come back with our revised proposal, we'll have another conversation about what those important elements are that we want to communicate to City Council and focus on, or sharpen the focus on, the ones that the Commission wants to elevate. So rather than a laundry list, let's perhaps bring it down to a more fine-tuned and targeted set of additional recommendations. So we already talked about the critical components. Let's not talk about those again. Thank you.
Anything else before I try to adjourn us?
There's 17 more slides now.
Any other comments or questions for staff? Nope.
We wanted to thank the commission for hanging in there through all of these work sessions. I know it's been a lot of information. So thank you for your time.
Well, and I have to put it right back to staff. Thank you. We asked a lot of questions, threw a lot of change at you, and you guys were great in walking us through all of that work, and looking forward to continuing to work on it with you. But if there's no other items, nope, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's amazing. At the point where they said there was like 12 more. This is not